Yeophantong, the Geneva Press Club. We are really very glad and delighted to welcome for the second year running Don't Buy Into Occupation, a coalition of 24 European and Palestinian organizations and trade unions that publishes an annual report on the financial links between certain European financial institutions and companies involved in activities in the occupied Palestinian territories. This year, the coalition has broadened the scope of its report in response to the tragic deterioration of the situation on the ground and the positions taken by the International Court of Justice. Today's panel of speakers will discuss on the sidelines on the 14th Business and Human Rights Forum, the effectiveness of human rights protection criteria and obligation under international humanitarian law. I give the floor to the three speakers. First, Pichamon Yeophantong. She's not here. Okay, next. She's a chairperson UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights. Kamil Zabielski, head of sustainable investments, Storebrand asset management, right? And Max Hammer, first time here, welcome, human rights campaigner. And Andrew Preston, senior advisor, Norwegian's People's Head, will be the moderator of the conference. I give the floor. Andrew. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Geraldine, and good afternoon to everybody here, and hello to everybody who's following us online. So, as Geraldine mentioned, we are a coalition of 25 organizations and trades unions from Palestine, Belgium, France, Ireland, the Netherlands, Norway, Spain, and the United Kingdom. And we've been producing this report every year since 2021. And this is our fifth annual report, produced with the help of a research organization in the Netherlands called Profundo. So what we're going to do today, we have 1 hour, and we are going to get a presentation of the report from one of the members of the Don't Buy Into Occupation Coalition. We're going to have a response to the report from two of our panelists, and then we'll have hopefully around half an hour for questions and discussion. So please think about that before we get to that point. So what I'm going to do, Pichamon, one of our panelists, is slightly delayed, so she's going to probably burst in a little bit later. But I'm going to begin by introducing our panel. So a warm welcome to our four panelists. First, Pichamon, she's not here, but I'll introduce her nonetheless. She is the chair of the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights. She's also associate professor and head of research at the Centre for Future Defence and National Security at Deakin University in Australia. She leads the Responsible Business Lab and the Environmental Justice and Human Rights Project funded by the Australian Research Council. And she's also held academic positions at the University of New South Wales, at Princeton and Oxford University, and holds a PhD and MA from the Australian National University. Our second panelist, Kamil Zabielski, is head of sustainable investment at Storebrand Asset Management in Norway. Kamil joined the sustainable investments team in 2021. Previous to that, he worked as head of sustainability at the Norwegian Export Credit Agency, GIEC, and as advisor at the Council of Ethics for the Norwegian Government Pension Fund, the Norway's Sovereign Wealth Fund. He has a specialization in human rights and labor rights, conducting due diligence of companies and evaluating environmental and social risks and impacts of projects in a wide range of sectors. and he has an LLM in international law and MPhil in human rights law from the University of Oslo. Then we have Max Hammer from Don't Buy Into Occupation, but also representing his organization, BankTrack, which is the international organization targeting private sector commercial banks and the activities they finance. Max leads BankTrack's project work on banks and conflict zones, which challenges banks and financial institutions to respect their human rights responsibilities in situations of armed conflict. He's previously worked as a legal researcher and served on the leadership team of the Palestine Solidarity Movement, NAMOD, British Jews Against Occupation. And he holds an MPhil from Cambridge and a BSc from the London School of Economics, and works out of London. And finally, a late entrant to the panel. Very glad to have with us also Sam Jones, which I think many of you will have seen at the forum earlier this week. Sam is president and co-founder of Heartland Initiative, a non-profit, practice-based research organization that promotes the fundamental rights and freedoms of people in conflict-affected and high-risk areas. And through tailored learning services, Heartland Initiative works with stakeholders to develop solutions that prevent and mitigate human rights harms while managing the heightened risks faced by companies and investors in conflict-affected and high-risk areas, also known as CARA, which is an acronym that Sam likes to use. And before co-founding the Heartland Initiative, Sam worked as Associate Director of the Human Rights Program at the Carter Center, managing programs in the DRC. He's a graduate of the University of North Carolina, Asheville, and has a master's degree in the International Peace and Conflict Resolution from American University's School of International Service. So that's our panel. And the order of play is that Max, as I said, will present the report now for about 10 to 15 minutes, and then we will hear from Pichamon, hopefully, and Kamil about the report, and then we will have a discussion. So over to you, Max.
Thank you very much. And thanks again to Andrew for moderating. So as Andrew alluded to, when we first launched the Don't Buy Into Occupation report in 2021, we did so to investigate which financial institutions were investing in and lending to companies that were involved in specifically Israel's settlement enterprise. And we tried to craft the report's recommendations around financial institutions and businesses' responsibilities in line with the UN Guiding Principles and the OECD guidelines. But as we've heard now, we've expanded the scope a little bit in the 5th year of publishing the report because the context in which we're collecting this information has changed fairly dramatically. As all of you will be aware, the situation on the ground in the occupied Palestinian territory has deteriorated drastically since October 2023, both in Gaza, where Israel's military campaign that is now widely understood to constitute a genocide has caused hundreds of thousands of casualties, displaced millions, and rendered the whole region virtually uninhabitable, including, by the way, by continuing to wreck Gaza's infrastructure since the agreement of a ceasefire in October. And in the West Bank as well, where Israel has drastically ramped up its illegal activities, not just in regards to the expansion of the settlement construction, but by killing hundreds of Palestinians since October 2023, by aiding and abetting regular settler attacks, by moving to establish full military control over an ever-growing zone of Palestinian territory, and moving blatantly towards full annexation of the region. So we're facing a fairly desperate situation at the launch of this report, and it's against this background that this year's report looks a little bit different to the previous 4. So where previous ones focused specifically on the settlement enterprise, the escalating situation on the ground, which is one that international businesses are playing an active part in maintaining, has made clear that these businesses are now playing a much wider role beyond the settlement enterprise in contributing to violations of international law committed by Israel in the occupied Palestinian territory. UN Special Rapporteur Francesca Albanese summarized this quite explicitly in the introduction to this year's report when she said, and I quote, "The complicity of private actors can no longer be assessed today solely through the lens of occupation. It must encompass their role in enabling and profiting from the illegal situation as a whole, considering also that it has metastasized into genocide." So our report sort of draws from this understanding of private actors' shifting role in the occupied territory to adopt an expanded scope that no longer considers just those companies that are helping to maintain the settlement enterprise, but rather companies that have a well-documented role in supporting all of Israel's violations of international law in the occupied Palestinian territory. And this expansion in scope takes place, as we heard just a second ago, both in response to the deteriorating situation on the ground, but also in the wake of several international legal developments over the past few years, which carry very significant implications for the responsibilities and legal obligations both of state, but also of non-state actors. And two stand out in particular here, two legal developments. The first was the order that the International Court of Justice issued in January 2024 on the case of South Africa v. Israel, in which it first ruled that Israel had plausibly infringed on the rights of the Palestinian population under the 1948 Genocide Convention. And this is a ruling, as you'll be aware, that's been affirmed since then by further UN investigations, including recently a UN Commission of Inquiry in September that found that Israel has indeed been committing genocide in Gaza. And the second landmark legal development was issued by the ICJ as an advisory opinion in July 2024, when it found that Israel's entire presence in the occupied Palestinian territory since 1967 is illegal under international law. Or in other words, the entire occupation enterprise, not just settlement construction and the maintenance of settlements, is a breach of Palestinian self-determination and also a breach of international conventions, including international conventions that prohibit apartheid. So these two legal developments, two rulings, have given new legal weight to Israel's activities in the occupied Palestinian territory, and subsequent guidance by international bodies has made clear that it also gives new legal weight to the actions of private actors who face new and expanded responsibilities and obligations in this context. So on the human rights responsibilities front, the OHCHR and the UNHRC have been very clear that businesses which are linked to Israel's occupation can no longer mitigate their contributions to adverse human rights impacts in this situation. So they have a responsibility under the UN guiding principles, according to the OHCHR's guidance, to cease all business activities that link them to the occupation. Again, the whole occupation, not just the settlement enterprise. And financial institutions, meanwhile, have a responsibility to engage with their clients to this end and to consider divesting in situations where adverse human rights impacts cannot be mitigated through productive engagement and through the use of leverage. And moving beyond human rights responsibilities into legal obligations, as Francesca Albanese most notably pointed out in a report that was issued by her office this June, many businesses now actually face the risk of complicity in international crime over their involvement in Israel's illegal activities. Albanese goes so far as to say that businesses which contribute to the occupation can be held legally accountable for human rights and international law violations, and that echoes guidance by UN experts that states that businesses that contribute to Israel's military campaign in Gaza risk being found liable for their role in aiding and abetting genocide. So what we're talking about here is no longer just businesses that are failing to uphold their responsibilities as regards the settlement enterprise. We are talking about businesses, rather, whose activities pose risks under international law because they are assisting in maintaining a deteriorating illegal situation in the occupied Palestinian territory. And of course, this in turn carries additional risks for the financial institutions that maintain links with these businesses. And this is where we proceed as a starting point for the findings and the data in our 2025 report. So we're looking now at the links between European financial institutions and companies who are helping to maintain any of Israel's illegal activities in the occupied Palestinian territory. That includes apartheid, it includes the occupation as a whole, it includes genocide as well. And as we do every year, we enlisted the help of Profundo to collect data on the links between European FIs and a set of companies. And the expansion in scope has meant that this year, that list of companies encompasses 108 businesses, compared to 58 companies last year. So the number of companies in the report has almost doubled as a result of the expanding role that private actors are playing in facilitating violations of international law in the occupied Palestinian territory. And what we found as a result of the data that we collected with the help of Profundo was that between January 2023 and August 2025, 1,115 European financial institutions, so that's banks, asset managers, insurance companies, and pension funds, had financial relationships with one or more of these 108 companies. Now, Just to briefly dive into what companies we're talking about here, many of these companies are the ones that were included in previous Don't Buy Into Occupation reports. So that includes companies like Israel's Bank Hapoalim and Bank Leumi, which provide financing to settlement developers. It includes big multinationals like Caterpillar, which provide machinery for the demolition of Palestinian homes. It includes companies like Airbnb and Booking.com, which market overnight stays in the settlements, and includes manufacturing companies like Germany's Heidelberg Materials, which continue to play an active role in exploiting Palestinian natural resources. But the expansion in scope also means that we are now looking at many new companies which are involved in a range of activities previously not considered in the report that help Israel to continue to violate international law. So that includes notably a large number of arms companies that have played a major role in facilitating Israel's genocidal actions in Gaza. These are companies like Lockheed Martin or Honeywell. It also includes international companies like Maersk and Oracle for the first time, which might not be directly operating in the settlements, but are providing some type of logistic or technical support that helps Israel maintain the occupation enterprise more broadly. And perhaps most consequentially for a lot of financial institutions, new companies have also been added in the space of major tech multinationals. So that's household names like Intel, Microsoft, Amazon, Google, that have been providing technological support for Israel's occupation or for the genocide in Gaza. So in total, during the period of January 2023 to August 2025, we found that the financial relationships between European financial institutions and these companies, so that's credits, underwriting services, share, and bond holdings altogether, amounted to more than 1.8 trillion US dollars. So that's obviously a massive figure. It's one that's more than doubled from the previous report as the scope of the report has increased. And just to clarify, we are of course not saying that all of this credit and all of this investment goes specifically to support the business activities in question in the report. Of course it doesn't. But what the scale of these figures does indicate is that companies which are involved in these activities are still receiving monumental amounts of lending and investment services. And when this is happening at such a monumental scale as is detailed in the report, it indicates that many financial institutions are probably not asking some of the questions that they have a responsibility to ask when they establish financial relationships with companies whose activities are relevant for conflict-affected areas. What it specifically indicates is that many financial institutions are almost certainly still not conducting heightened human rights due diligence for many of these financial relationships at the scale that they should be, which they have a responsibility to do in conflict zones under the UN Guiding Principles, or using their leverage to exert an influence on these business relationships to push them towards doing a better job on these human rights activities or human rights outcomes. And it also tells us, finally, that many financial institutions might be giving these companies an overly generous time frame to improve their human rights outcomes before taking a responsible decision to divest based on the fact that human rights outcomes might not be able to be improved by exerting leverage on these companies. So we're going to dive just a little bit deeper into some of the specific data now. So to start, you'll see on the slide here the 10 European creditors which we've identified in our data set as providing the largest amount of financing to these companies in the time frame, and you'll see their total financial contributions range from around $11 billion, that's NatWest in the UK at number 10, to about $41 billion at the top with BNP Paribas in France. And then here, for context, are the 10 European investors which maintain the largest share in bond holdings in these companies, and the numbers here, as you'll see, are even significantly higher. They range from about $34 billion at the bottom with Nordea in Finland to $190 billion at the top with Norway's sovereign wealth fund, the Government Pension Fund Global. So what these numbers, which again refer to total financial relationships, indicate is that the changing legal weight of Israel's activities in the occupied Palestinian territory and the expanded role that businesses play in facilitating those violations of international law carries very significant implications for a lot of these financial institutions, because so many more of their business relationships may now be tied to activities that help facilitate violations of international law. And this is perhaps most evident if we compare some of these figures with last year's figures from the 2024 report. So you'll notice the list of financial institutions represented in these graphics is actually quite similar to this year. BNP Paribas and Government Pension Fund Global still at the top of the respective tables, but what's really striking is how the numbers have changed and expanded. So in last year's report, for example, we identified that BNP Paribas had provided about $28 billion in financing to the 58 companies that were included in that report. This year, that's $41 billion to 108 companies. And on the investor side, the difference is even more striking. We're looking at about $20 billion in share and bond holdings last year versus $190 billion this year for the Government Pension Fund Global. And a major reason for this growth is what I mentioned earlier. So many companies included for the first time this year are household names, especially in the tech sector. And when companies like Amazon and Google are involved in violations of international law, that poses very serious implications for financial institutions because so many of them are likely to have links to these household names. And what's particularly notable is that this is happening in a context in which many of the institutions included in our report actually have taken significant steps towards addressing at least some of their financial links to several of the companies listed in the report. So we highlight in the report that some institutions are taking conscientious steps, especially pension funds have started to divest from several DBIO listed companies in the past year, and many more are conducting heightened due diligence and trying to exert influence on portfolio companies where they can. But as the report shows, this movement has not been enough to stem the overall trend, which is that the overall financial exposure has significantly increased as more companies have become involved in Israel's violations of international law. So I'll just conclude briefly against that context by reflecting on the recommendations that we make in the report. And we make a total of 23, so I won't go through all of them here, but perhaps most relevant is this point. We are now for the first time, as a top-line recommendation in the report, explicitly calling on financial institutions to promptly divest from companies when they find that they're not able to exert meaningful leverage to prevent and mitigate human rights harms. So that might not be the case for all companies here, but it certainly may be for some which have exhibited no progress for years on their contributions to very egregious violations of international law. And the reason that we're taking this step is because this is now an unprecedented situation, and so it demands a decisive response from the financial sector. Again, we're publishing this report in a context in which Israel is finding itself implicated in ever more flagrant violations of international law. And as we put forward in our recommendations, European governments now have a responsibility to take legal action against some companies that are complicit in these violations of international law. So when we're calling for responsible divestment in some contexts, we're not doing so lightly. We are doing so because some of these companies are now risking liability in international crimes. And in this context where these issues are so persistent and urgent and critical from a legal perspective, financial institutions have a responsibility to take seriously even those steps that might previously have been considered drastic. As we've heard over and over again this week, the fact that respecting human rights might be difficult to do in some contexts does not exempt private actors from the responsibility to respect those human rights guidelines that we have all developed together. Thanks. Back to you, Andrew.
Okay, thank you very much, Max. Then we will call on Kamil to come with the first response to the report. Over to you.
Can you hear me? What about now? What about now? Yeah. I'm going to move over. All right, I'll just take it from here. All right, thanks, Max. First of all, we do welcome this report. Important for us that investors are conducting heightened human rights due diligence, particularly in high-risk human rights areas, including occupied territories in Palestine. So we do welcome the report in that regard. Very shortly about Storebrand, for those that do not know us, we are Norway's largest private asset manager. The only one bigger than us is the oil fund, and they're public. We are one of the original founding members of the UNPRI and have been working with sustainable investment for 30 years, including working on occupied territories since 2009. So this is not anything that is new for us. We formally exclude companies that are in breach of international humanitarian law, including in occupied territories, but not only there, in West Sahara and other conflict areas, if the company, through our engagement, and we're unable to influence them through our engagement to change their practices. So in the last 15 years, out of the 104, I counted 104, you said 108, 104 companies, we have formally and publicly excluded 37 companies. Also tech companies and infrastructure companies, which other investors have not excluded, at least not many of them. We have also formally excluded 5 additional companies which are not on your list. So also a note that it is a non-exhaustive list. There are also companies that are involved in violations outside of this list. Out of the 100 companies in the report, we currently have holdings in 30 companies, in which we have engagements with all of these companies on various levels. And out of these 30 companies, 85% of our holdings are within 5 companies, just to give you a bit of a perspective on that. So that in mind, what is the report trying to do? I understand that the report wants to bring attention to financial institutions with investments in controversial companies in occupied territories. But the message from the report, as I read it, is not that investors should immediately divest from all of these companies. They need to use their leverage to try to influence. The report is calling on investors to follow their commitment to NGPs and do their due diligence. Try to use the leverage that they have to influence the companies, and as a last resort, if they're unable to do that, to exclude. And this is what we have been doing in Storebrand since 2009. And although exclusion is an option, and it is an important tool that we have, it is not the first step that we take, nor is it the first step that most investors take. Just to clarify that. I think the report correctly differentiates between types of financial institutions, between creditors, those that are doing lending and underwriting and project financing, and asset managers like ourselves that are investing in equities and bonds in the secondary market. Now, I think this is very important, as the level of due diligence that is required and the leverage that a bank has through project financing and corporate lending is very different than the leverage that we as an asset manager may have with only 1% shares, and often much less than 1% shares in a globally traded company. So I think the recommendations in the report to financial institutions could have been strengthened and been more relevant if they reflected the division in the analysis that you made in the report itself. So having differentiating recommendations for these 2 different types of financial institutions. I also want to make a comment on table 2. So you have 2 tables. The second table has a list of the 100 investors with the largest holdings. What is the intention behind this table? What do the total holdings actually tell one about what an investor is actually doing on OPT risks? So this list can appear perhaps more or less a ranking of the largest European asset managers, more so than a ranking of investors that actually have due diligence processes in place to actively mitigate OPT risk. I mean, this can be a goal in itself to raise awareness, but it is perhaps not saying much except for that you're a big investor and therefore you are more exposed than a smaller investor. Just an observation. It would be, however, interesting to see which investors actually have policies and processes to do heightened human rights due diligence and correlate that to the holdings somehow. Another value-added measurement for comparison could have been to also include a breakdown per investor as to how many of these 104 companies they actually have holdings in, as opposed to the total combined holdings. Like I mentioned to you before, we are invested in 30 companies, but basically all of our holdings are in 5 of those companies. And this also comes back to investment strategies and mandates. So through index or passive investing, all investors that have this kind of strategy will follow a global benchmark. And the most common is MSCI, MSCI World All Countries. For those investors in here who are familiar with that, it's around 2,500 companies. This means that all investors will be invested in these companies that are in the benchmark. And of the 104 companies on your list, there's about 60 of them that are in this global benchmark, and 40 which are not. Which means that if a company is to exclude from this benchmark, it would create what's called tracking error, and clients don't like that. So then you need to replace that company with another company that has similar characteristics that will meet the benchmark. It's a bit technical, but that's how it works. So it's much more difficult to exclude a company from index invested fund than it is for an actively managed fund. The roughly 40 companies on the list that are not the global benchmark are could be in a way an interesting test of an investor's due diligence process. For these companies, most investors would actively have to take a decision to invest in this company, either through an actively managed fund, or for an index, they would actively have to bring it into the benchmark outside of its portfolio, meaning they would have to do a due diligence on this company to invest in it. Storebrand, for example, we have no investments in any of the 40 companies outside of the benchmark. So that can also be an interesting way of analyzing whether or not an investor actually has heightened human rights due diligence process, if they have to make an active decision to invest in that company. So just to conclude, again, I welcome the report. I think that some nuance could be helpful for going forward for different types of investments and holdings. Looking at investor policies on heightened human rights due diligence and differentiating between the recommendations for the types of financial institutions. I'll just leave it at that. Sorry.
Thank you very much, Kamil. That was very useful to get your feedback, and we will certainly be taking that further with us. Pichamon, welcome to the cinema.
Thank you.
Good to have you here. You've already been introduced, so I won't do that again, but are you ready to give us a short response to the report itself? Would you like to wait until...
Could I wait a little bit just so that...
Sure. Okay. So, moving right along, we have, time is running away from us as always in the UN Forum. We have 25 minutes. I have a couple of questions to get us going, but please think about what you would like to ask the panel, and we'll try and get as many questions over to them as possible. Okay, so we've been talking, my impression of the sessions from the UN Forum for Business of Human Rights, those of us who are in Geneva, has been that there's been quite a lot of talk about upstream due diligence. In other words, the due diligence that we do when we source materials from suppliers. But I think to a lesser degree, there has been talk about downstream due diligence. What happens to the products, the finished products that companies produce? Which customers are they going to? And what due diligence are we doing downstream? And this applies obviously to the tech companies that have come to the report this year, and other companies who have been documented as supplying different types of equipment to the Israeli army, for example, and to sustaining the occupation and apartheid. So a question really to the panel then is this a fair reflection of of part of the problem, that there is too little focus on downstream due diligence, and what can we do about that? Who would like to take that? Pichamon, would you like to begin with that?
Sure, I can start with that, because I think it's a very fair point that we haven't really focused as much on downstream due diligence, even though we do see a lot of businesses now taking that into consideration. Having joined some of the business association meetings, in fact in Washington, D.C. very recently, one of the key issues they raised was precisely this. How do we go about downstream human rights due diligence? Now, it shouldn't be overly complicated in a sense, and we already see a lot of kind of departure points, especially when it comes to tech companies and so forth. But for the working group itself, we've also issued communications that set out what businesses ought to be doing in order to conduct downstream human rights due diligence, especially in relation to the occupied Palestinian territory. So in light of that, it's a fair point that I will certainly take back to other members of the working group to see how we can really sharpen our focus on this part of the due diligence process in future iterations of the forum. But we would also welcome you to provide feedback in relation to how we could potentially incorporate this as well into the activities that we're currently doing, including in future information notes or reports that we undertake. Thank you.
Yeah, there we go. So let's just look at the tech companies or the tech industry briefly. So a lot of the major Silicon Valley companies have done a great job in terms of developing global human rights policies, associated practices that are public facing, in terms of how they're aligned with UNGPs, the OECDs. They've been quite successful in terms of conflict minerals reporting and the like. But to this point on downstream due diligence, what they are decidedly less adept at is thinking about how their products are being used in an increasing way in military surveillance and censorship operations conducted by customers who have not been properly screened or taken through due diligence processes. So if you look at the example of Gaza, and reporting has been quite good, you know, from The Guardian, from Local Call, from 972 Mag, but you have Project Nimbus, for example, headed up by Alphabet and Amazon. You have Palantir and their relationship with the Israeli Defense Forces for providing artificial intelligence. And then you have the deployment of lethal force, either through autonomous weaponry or through human-controlled weaponry. And I think what we're seeing, and there are some exceptions to this, but what we're seeing largely is that those tech companies will talk to you all day about artificial intelligence, human rights, and things like education, healthcare, urban planning, things like that. When you try to engage them about their military operations in which their products and services may not have been designed for that, but have been misused in that way, the simple refrain is, if they respond at all, we're not a weapons company, which from an institutional investment perspective is incredibly challenging, because we are reaching a time with this blurring of the defense and tech industries as represented not only in Gaza, but an increasing number of armed conflicts. What is a weapons company? What is a weapons system? How do you do, for example, product-based exclusion from an investment portfolio, not for landmines and cluster munitions, but when it comes to military AI, when it comes to lethal autonomous weapon systems? And further, how do you connect the companies that are involved in the development of the software, the augmentation of weapon systems in a meaningful way that allows investors, per Kamil's point, to make informed decisions on the basis of international law, but in a way that is sophisticated. And I would say that Don't Buy Into Occupation Report has consistently provided an essential source of data as it relates to more granular reporting, the way in which these different companies' products and services are being used on the ground, including by those tech companies. I'll start there.
Would you like to add anything, Kamil?
Yeah. Yes, Sam, you hit the nail on the head. It's very challenging to get some of these companies to open up on this. I think as an investor, we need to look at this in the form of prioritization. So at least the methodology that we have is that we try to prioritize according to potential contribution to severe human rights impacts. So in that sense, we have 3 levels of prioritization, which is also something that I kind of miss in the report, is kind of associating each companies as being equal in a way, but there are companies there that are involved in contributing to much more serious violations than others. So we try to prioritize those that are involved in through military technology, through surveillance, through weapons, etc., as a first priority, and then you engage with them, you challenge them on heightened human rights due diligence or a conflict-specific analysis, which is not easy. And then you have a second level of prioritization, and those are companies that are contributing to construction in the illegal settlements, maintenance and expansion projects, also renewable energy projects or direct financing. And then you have a third level, which is what we call goods and services, where perhaps some of these travel companies will fall in. And for us as an investor, this is one way of at least categorizing this. So where should we put our effort and resources to try to engage and to get that information and put pressure on them?
Okay, thank you. So, follow-up question before we open up for the floor is really, if given the state of affairs and the inadequacy of downstream due diligence today, would it make more sense to have a sanctions regime in place? Do sanctions regimes make it easier for companies, obviously, but also for financial institutions to deal with these issues? And again, please draw on your experience from other conflict areas.
So, reflecting on the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the Biden administration unleashed what was, I think, credibly called an unprecedented array of sanctions around Russian individuals and entities. And the unintended effect of that was sending a signal, though, to companies that if we are sanctions compliant with all these sanctions out there, we're simply doing enough. What more do you want from us? Our response is that sanctions compliance is the floor, not the ceiling, in terms of the UNGPs. So I think there is certain advantages to sanctions. I think the historic lack of sanctions as it relates to the occupation has been a major problem because it's sent conflicting messages to different types of institutional investors, but it can also lower the threshold that companies and investors have to be doing more in a state of heightened risk, like conflict-affected and high-risk areas. Their due diligence has to be correspondingly heightened.
Yeah, I think that's right. I can only echo that from our experience. Also, working on the Russia-Ukraine issue specifically, we saw sanctions compliance in the first instance. We saw that unprecedented application of sanctions not only by the US but also by the EU and the UK. And what we saw beyond that was that the corporate movement towards taking responsible action was limited and very piecemeal. So some businesses exited responsibly Russia or took some other measures to reduce their risk of contributing to human rights responsibilities beyond the sanctions regime. Many didn't. Where sanctions are useful and where I think they might be useful in this case is by providing clarity and a little bit of a floor to investors. So as Kamil pointed out earlier, we are not calling for investors to take the same action in relation to every one of the 100 plus companies in this report, right? Divestment may be the most applicable course of action in some cases where previous engagement has not yielded any improvement on human rights harms over a certain period. In other cases, engagement and using leverage may be more important. Where sanctions can be useful is providing clarity on, certain exclusions that are mandatory, providing a little bit of a legal guideline against which we can understand what the most appropriate course of action is. The risk is that then companies use that as a floor, as an excuse not to take further action. Even in cases where sanctions are in place, companies have a responsibility to act in line with the UNGPs, and I think that's the risk of applying sanctions in a case like this, is that companies then consider their job to be done just by being compliant.
I can only agree with what Max and Sam have said, and we've seen these issues emerge also in the Myanmar context, right, where sanctions haven't had the same effects that perhaps the people imposing them were anticipating them to have. And if anything, we also see one could, I suppose, frame it as unintended consequences of these sanctions as well on the local population, when immediately businesses think that we will be compliant by immediately withdrawing and a range of other things and not doing business, right? And we know that there are moral dilemmas, ethical dilemmas attached to that, but it is important to remember that looking at the Myanmar example, the situation did not improve for the Myanmar people when those sanctions were still being implemented. So what we want to see are businesses learning quickly from these situations so that they know that they need to conduct heightened human rights due diligence and put in place measures to safeguard whether they should decide to remain or exit, right? So this is where, again, I would say a human rights-based approach to this issue doesn't immediately point to the imposition of sanctions.
Okay. So are there some questions from those of you who are present in the room? And for those of you following online, I'm afraid we're going to have to prioritise those people who are in the room. Please, there's a microphone coming.
Can you hear me? Yes. I have a question about passive investment and index funds. We're seeing, and maybe this might be more for Sam because I recognize the report focuses on European funds, but in the US we're seeing pushback. The state of Florida, Alabama, I think Montana recently as well, are investigating MSCI for attempts to, or at least allegations that they are divesting from companies that are in the occupied Palestinian territories or Gaza. There's the use of anti-BDS legislation at a state level that penalizes pension fund investments into companies that are perceived to be part of the BDS movement. Can you comment on this tension between this US pressure to counter the push to divest?
I would defer to European colleagues to talk about the chilling effect that conditions in the U.S. has had, but anti-BDS legislation is passed in over 30 American states, both Democratic and Republican-led. They've been successfully challenged as being constitutionally unlawful when they get to court, but the intended effect was to have that chilling effect to begin with. The most notable example of this perhaps is what happened with Morningstar Sustainalytics and the weaponization of anti-BDS legislation against the company around their Israel-Palestine controversy ratings. I guess the question for me was always, why did the firm not simply state that all we are saying is that it is risky to do business in the occupied Palestinian territories? It is risky to do business in terms of human rights, and it is risky to do business in terms of potential material impacts, whether that's legal, regulatory, operational, or reputational. And if you need any proof of that, you can go to the U.S. State Department travel advisory warnings, you can go to Human Rights Watch, you can go to the Economist Intelligence Unit, the Wall Street Journal, and there were any number of ways that could be done. That said, the political reality is that investors in the U.S. Are under actual legal risk, and this is something oftentimes that the advocacy community does not fully understand, that there are very real legal and political risks. And for investors that are unable to demonstrate that they are applying a consistent global standardized set of evaluation criteria when they're making these determinations, then they can find themselves either the subject of a political campaign or a lawsuit, thus potentially putting at risk the myriad work they're doing not only on Israel-Palestine, but on other conflict-affected and high-risk areas, on climate change, any number of ESG issues.
Try to be very careful what I say here, but yes, it is a reality that the anti-BDS laws in the United States will have an impact also on European investors, especially those that are publicly traded companies like ourselves. We are formally boycotted by many states in the United States because they perceive us as boycotting Israel, even though if you look at the legislation and the way that it's written, we do not do that because we do not boycott Israel. We invest in Israeli companies, although quite a limited amount of them, but we do not have a policy to boycott against Israel. But if you exclude a company, in particular if you do it publicly, then you will be within the scope of some of these laws. And that is a concern. How transparent do we want to be? We have been very transparent in Storebrand and in Scandinavia in general. Will this have an impact on our level of transparency because of risk of boycott, risk of commercial and business risk, litigation risk? So it is a real dilemma that we have to be open about. And the question is, what do we do in this situation?
I'm going to ask, just to follow up to you, Pichamon, I don't see any hands right now, but as one of the central people in the human rights ecosystem, as the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights called it at the plenary, the opening plenary, you both Volker Turk, the UN High Commissioner, and yourself have expressed real concern that human rights are in survival mode. And I think you came out with one of the more memorable lines from the UN Forum this week, where you said the UN guiding principles must remain our compass and a beacon of hope. And when you, in your position, hear about the difficulties of trying to do the right thing because of politicization and other factors, what is your answer to that? How can we go about ensuring that the human rights agenda is still front and center?
Thank you for that, because it honestly is one of those kind of deeper systemic issues that keeps one awake at night. I am starting to slur my words. It's the third day of the forum, and I do apologize for joining late as well. But it genuinely is serious, because we see assaults from all sides, even from states that we would normally count as, champions, allies in this business and human rights or broader human rights movement. We are seeing backtracking. But it's the language of politicization of human rights has been around for a very long time, and that is deeply problematic, because human rights are, needless to say, they should not be politicized. They are about our rights. They're not about the rights of the state. They are the rights about the individual, the person, right? So in that regard, it's deeply troubling when people start saying that, oh, these are your rights, not mine, or these are your values, not mine. From my perspective, and I know that some people do say that talking about human rights or upholding human rights is about values-driven action. From my perspective, values has become a heavily kind of politically laden term. My perspective is that upholding human rights is not about values. It's actually what we should be doing. It should be a norm, not a value, if that makes sense. But we are seeing with greater frequency, we're seeing the manipulation, the perversion of the language of human rights by certain actors as well. And this is where, the situation is one where we are trying to make sure, in the case of businesses, including investors, that the business case that I'm sure you've been hearing a lot over the past couple of days, that does not become part of the politicization narrative. That when we talk about the business case for human rights, to me that sounds even weirder now than ever before, because it's been more than 10 years since we've had the UN guiding principles. We shouldn't still have to reiterate that it makes business sense for businesses to be conducting human rights due diligence. And in the same way, when we say you should conduct human rights due diligence to detect forced labor or to detect gross and systemic violations and abuses of human rights as a result of the products or the services that you produce or that you provide, that shouldn't be something that comes under question yet again. And it shouldn't be something that gets justified in relation to, will this have an impact on our profit margins? And I'm seeing that backtracking back to the language of, okay, how does this fit in with our business model and our desire to turn a profit? And that is also very concerning. So we see, in one sense, the politicization, but my fear also is the externalization and commercialization of human rights due diligence as a process, alongside that broader politicization narrative. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question exactly, but as I say before, we're seeing it from all sides, and from places, from people, from organizations, from states that we would not have expected to not be on the side of human rights. So this is where, again, it's a very, very disturbing reality that we live in right now.
Okay, I'm going to, as the moderator, I'm going to use my privilege to just ask one final question before we send you back to the forum. I want to take us to Norway, because as you saw on the slides from Max, the Sovereign Wealth Fund of Norway is the largest investor in terms of shares and bond holdings. And as some of you may have been following in the international media, there has been a massive media and political storm in Norway since August related to some of the sovereign wealth funds holdings in companies linked again to occupation and apartheid in Palestine. To cut a long story short, the government has decided to appoint a committee of experts to review the wealth fund's ethical framework, and at the same time has paused some aspects of the ethical functioning of the fund as it is today. And the government has raised a number of dilemmas related to what we're talking about today, including the question of what responsibility attaches to minority shareholdings in a company and shareholdings in a company where just a modest share of its activity is linked to norm violations. In a sense, the government is challenging that, and for those of us who've been following this for some time, we know that the OECD dealt with this issue back in 2017. So the question is, what would your advice be to the committee of experts who are going to go through the ethical framework, if it's possible to do that in a very short, 1 minute response?
Okay. So I'm going to focus specifically on the decision to divest from Caterpillar, because it's one in which we're quite familiar with, which has played a role in the current controversy. Caterpillar is a company that has been engaged by institutional investors for over 2 decades, specifically around their risk in Israel and the OPT. We've been a part of those engagements for the last 8 to 10 years. So the company cannot claim not to know. In addition to Israel OPT, they are also exposed to severe conflict and human rights risk in Myanmar, in Democratic Republic of Congo, Russia, Ukraine, and in at least 2 to 3 other conflict-affected and high-risk areas. They're also in violation of their own zero-tolerance policy around forced labor, because their exclusive distributor for CAP-branded merchandise is directly connected to 2 factories in Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. So this is why when we work with investors, engagements with companies, whether it's engagement or exclusion, it may be catalyzed by one prioritized risk. For example, the use of D9 bulldozers in military operations in Gaza. However, when it moves forward through the decision-making process, applying a conflict-affected and high-risk area lens broadly allows investors to say, we are analyzing the risks in Israel and OPT in the same way that we're analyzing them in XUAR, in Myanmar, in Russia, Ukraine. And so I think too often investors can fall into the trap of, and understandably so, and understandably in terms of risk prioritization, to Kamil's point, but this is where I think consistent application becomes absolutely critical, because it's not going to prevent politicization by those actors that are committed to politicization, but what it is going to do is to a degree insulate those institutions from claims of exceptionalization. And I wanted to bring that up because I think what has unfolded with the Sovereign Wealth Fund is a direct result of that.
Okay, Max, half a minute.
Yeah, I mean, you've pretty much taken the words out of my mouth in terms of, treating this conflict as part of a general risk assessment of conflict exposure. I think if we can achieve one thing with our recommendations in our report, and that is that exposure to the Israel-Palestinian conflict is treated as part of a general understanding of how to manage risks in conflict, then we will have done a lot. I would also say in the context of the Sovereign Wealth Fund, right, we have a set of recommendations in this report. We hope they are all adopted. We hope they are done so kind of universally as part of a universal adoption of the UN guiding principles. We also want to say, though, that we should not let perfect be the enemy of good here. If we are worried that major multinationals like Google or Apple are mentioned, Google or Amazon are mentioned in a report like this, and divesting from those companies is unrealistic, the response to that should not be to pause ethical divestment in general. It should be to assess this on a case-by-case basis, to make risk assessments based on certain companies, and to take actions that are in line with the UN guiding principles for each of those companies. That can look different from company to company, but the response is not to say that we're worried about the implications of our relationship with one company, and so therefore we just drop the whole thing entirely.
Okay, thank you. Pichamon?
I can
Brief
only
response.
brief. I can only agree. I mean, I think when it comes to preventing the claims of politicization, it is about ensuring policy coherence and consistency in application across all cases where you see conflict or challenging contexts more generally as well. But I would say one of the things is about moving from exclusion-based ethics to continuous risk-based human rights due diligence, right? I mean, this is where, again, we need to see that also applied throughout the investment cycle. So that would be my takeaway.
Very briefly, as someone that has worked in the Council of Ethics in Norway, they work on many different things. It's not just conflict and human rights. That is a part of it, but they work on environmental damage, on biodiversity, on corruption, on many different issues. So I'm personally disappointed that the whole thing is on pause because there's many other issues that are also quite pressing that they can keep working on. And unfortunately, when you take away let's say, the teeth from that system, and it is a tool that we use. The threat of a potential exclusion brings actors to the table. So that is an unfortunate loss of a tool that could have been utilized. On the question that you have, Andrew, on exposure where a company has, let's say, a minimal, insignificant amount of their revenue coming from a certain activity. My discussion with companies when that is the case is this. If it is so insignificant, why are you taking the reputational, sanctions, and other risks? Why don't you just sell out of it? Get rid of it. And we don't have to have these conversations for the next half year. But it's not so easy because often there's other reasons behind that insignificant involvement that we might not always know and they might not always share with us. But at the end of the day, for us, our policy is that if it's a breach of international human rights law and humanitarian law, if it's a serious breach, not willing to mitigate it, it doesn't matter if it's 1% or if it's 50% of the revenue.
Thank you to the panel. We'll pass on the advice when we get back to Norway. So thank you to everybody who's been following online. Thank you to those of you who made it up to the Geneva Press Club. And thank you first and foremost to our 4 panelists today. Thank you for all your contributions.